Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. I see it's about 2:01 here, according to my computer, and I know there's still a few people still joining. But just wanted to first of all thank you for joining this webinar today and welcome. My name is Scott Custard here with Moving Parts. Off to my right would be your left, I guess, is Dave Riebel. And we're going to talk today about wheat for flour. We've been doing these webinars now for, quite a while.
Couple of years or so.
Couple of years. And, I've never got a chance to do one. Not that I was begging to do one, but when the subject came up of doing wheat, Dave's standard line is that he doesn't like wheat.
I don't care about wheat.
He didn't care about wheat. He likes wheat. We all like wheat. I just wrote on the board here, everyone loves wheat.
I had chocolate cake for lunch, matter of fact.
There you go. Cake for lunch is never a bad thing. So our goal here today is to give everyone a bit of a primer, however you say that, on about wheat and its use for flour. So we're going to kind of cover some pretty high level, check that, maybe low level, however you want to say it. It's going to be some pretty elementary stuff for anybody that would be in the wheat procurement area, the flour procurement buying area, and any questions that you might have regarding that. Just a little background about me, if you're not aware. I've been in the business for over 30 years, and about 10 of that time was spent at ConAgra flour milling, and that's where I learned most of what I know about the wheat and flour markets was from my time at ConAgra. So again, I'll that's a bit of a good background for us, and I think we can go ahead and launch in here. Again, if you have questions along the way, please type them into the chat. Again, Martha is watching the chat very closely and can let us know if there are any questions. So first of all, a quick little history about wheat flour itself. It has been around in some way, shape, or form for thousands of years. People have been grinding grain between a couple of rocks, literally for 10,000 years. It has become, especially wheat flour and other cereal grains, oats and rye and that sort of thing. Those cereal grains have become, the flour from that milling has become a large part or staple food in many, many cultures. Certainly here in the United States and in Western civilization, we have bread, but there's many others, flatbreads, tortillas and other types of unleavened breads have been around for literally thousands and thousands of years. Back in the Roman era, they perfected the art of two stones together, the rotary stone. And that's what you see here on the far left. This is a human-powered rotary stone. These two stones are together, these discs, and you grab a hold of this handle and you give it a turn. You drop the grain in this hole on the top stone and grind them together and you get flour.
Seems like a lot of work.
It's a lot of work. So over the years, we went from doing this by hand to having horses and oxen turn that thing. And then guess what? We graduated to water power. You can see here, this is an old water wheel mill. And certainly you've probably seen windmills, very prevalent in northern and eastern Europe.
Really? I did not know that.
Holland. You know the windmills in Holland? That's a flour mill.
Really?
Right.
Well, there you go.
Now, in the late 19th century, the 1800s, for those that don't know, we graduated to a new technology. And that new technology was steel roller mills. And you can see these right here. Imagine, if you will, the rolling pin that you have at home that is used to make dough, roll out dough, if you do that at home. But you probably, if you don't have one at home, you probably saw mom or grandma use that rolling pin somewhere along the way. And think of it this way: there's two rolling pins side by side. And those rolling pins may be smooth, they may be rough, they may be grooved in one way or another. And they sit inside these machines. This is a modern flour mill, and every one of these machines has at least one set of these rollers. In fact, some of these machines will have two, perhaps even as many as four sets of rollers, where the wheat is dropped into the top, and then it's ground in some way, shape, or form, and then it comes out the bottom in another shape. So that's a lot of what goes on in today's flour mill. So we've come a long ways. This next slide is it's kind of funny. First of all, I apologize for the eye chart. I'm sure as you're watching online, it's very difficult to see what's going on or read those descriptions. But I think it's kind of funny. It says it's simplified diagram up here at the top. How flour is milled, and it's a simplified diagram. A couple of things. First, that's not necessarily what I would call a simple process, but we have come a long ways from, grinding two stones together to make this grain be turned into a powder. But the other thing to note, and to give you a little bit more of an idea about what's going on with these roller mills or mill rolls, if you can look at these two down here in the corner, this is essentially what would be our first break. After cleaning the wheat and separating all the stuff out of it, some tempering, etc., this is the first time the wheat is going to hit, quote unquote, the mill. And you see here, this is an end look or a cross-section end look of those two mill rolls. And again, they may be going in the same direction. They may be going in opposite direction. They may be going at different speeds. One may be smooth, one may be coarse, and there's a lot of different variations that go on with regard to that first break, as well as the second, third, and fourth break, etc.
So this wheat is getting ground multiple times.
Right.
Sometimes rollers are smooth, all the different variables you just mentioned, but that is, it's not like one or the other, like you're choosing this type of flour or that type of wheat. It's that you're going through multiple sets of these as you continue to grind the wheat further and further.
Right.
Okay.
I would say it this way. A good friend of mine, an old ConAgra colleague of mine, put it this way. Flour milling, wheat flour milling, is a consistent, gradual reduction process. Okay. It's a little bit different. In fact, it's a lot different from what we think of as other types of grain milling. If you look at dry corn milling, not the wet corn milling that we're using to make into sweeteners, but that dry corn milling, you're taking big rocks and making them into little rocks, right? That's all you're doing. You're grinding it up, and you don't have the tremendous complexity that you see here. Okay. In that other grain milling, you go from A to B to C to D, and you just start and you go down that road and nothing changes. In flour milling, you may go from A to B to C to D, but you might also go from A to B to A to B to A to B to C to A to D, back to A, et cetera, et cetera. And
is that why there's 4 sifters and 3 purifiers on the right 2 columns?
That's a great question, Dave. You're coming out of the first break, and so that's the most coarse flour that you're going to have. That flour then gets sifted, and you're going to take the bran and the germ off, and many times you're going to take whatever white flour is left from that and send it back through the mill one more time to make it even finer, a finer granulation. And there may be as much as 3 different breaks before you get all the way done. And that's why there's so many sifting and purifying. And here's another one, reducing rolls. and germ rolls and other more reducing rolls. So there's a lot of stuff going on, but essentially the process is still the same. You're taking a grain and you're grinding it up. You're trying to separate those different parts of that grain. Now, again, a lot of things have changed in 10,000 years, and a lot of things have changed just in 150 years. Back in the late 1800s, there was about 20,000 flour mills here in the United States.
Wow.
Now, a couple of things about that. First of all, most of those flour mills, I mean, almost any small agricultural town would have a flour mill, but it was probably a stone mill, a grist mill that was either powered by wind or probably by water until they were able to start running some of them by steam, etc. Today, there are only about 170 flour mills across the United States.
Skosh bigger, I suspect.
A lot of them are bigger. You can see, now I don't have 170 dots on this map, but you can see that they're pretty widely spread across the continental United States. I actually have a U.S. mill down in Puerto Rico. That used to be a Conagra mill, by the way. We got a big mill out in Hawaii. I don't believe there are any mills in Alaska right now. It's a little cold up there. But so things have changed. And along that same line, here's something else that has changed. You know, I've been doing this 101 presentation for a lot of our customers over the years. And I had to change this slide. I used to show the top 15 milling companies here in the United States. Today, I've dropped that number down to only 10. And the top 10 today produce almost as much as the top 15 did back in 2018.
Can you say consolidation?
Consolidation, and no bigger than that one at the very top, Arden Mills, you know, easily, very, very clearly the largest milling company in the United States today. But that is at the beginning was a joint venture between Conagra, Cargill, and Horizon Milling Company, which was a CHS asset. So anyway, a lot of consolidation. Last year in 2023, our U.S. total wheat flour grind, and you can see this on the USDA WASDE supply and demand balance sheets for wheat that we talk about so often, was 974 million bushels of wheat. And from that, we got production of 419 million hundredweights, or 41.9 billion pounds of flour. That's a lot of flour.
That's a lot of flour.
To give you a little bit of an idea, a normal bulk truck holds about 500 hundredweights. Okay, so again, we have graduated to a time where there's a lot more flour being made and a lot less companies making it. More on the notion of change. The United States' role in the world market has changed a lot in the last 50 or 60 years, certainly in the last 4 decades. I've got the numbers up there from 1985, when in the world we grew, totally the world, 495 million metric tons of wheat in the world. Today, we're nearly double that at 787. Okay, and it's going to be even more this year in 2024. The United States used to average about 1 billion bushels of annual wheat exports. For many, many years, we would grow 2 billion bushels of wheat on average, and about 1 billion of it was we would keep at home for our own domestic consumption, and we would sell into the world market about 1 billion bushels. Well,
back when they started calling us the breadbasket, right?
That's right. The breadbasket of the world. Back in the 60s and early 70s, there was a time when we did almost 50% of the world's exports. Today, that's not the case. The last 4 years, we're averaging less than 800 million bushels of exports of wheat into the world market. Our share of world exports has diminished dramatically. We're down to, we may not even make 8 or 10% this particular year. On that chart there, you see through 22, We didn't even make 12% of the world market. We have been supplanted by Russia as once upon a time, we were the largest exporter in the world. Not the case by a long shot today. Today, the United States is the world's exporter of last resort. So things definitely have changed. So enough about the change of our wheat market. Let's talk about the wheat kernel itself and actually, get to the stuff that we want to talk about, and that's actually the flour. This is a picture of the wheat kernel. Some people call it the wheat berry. It's made up of three basic components, and that picture is a lot older than me. It's been around for a long, long time. If you Google the wheat kernel, I'm sure you're going to come up with that picture somewhere along the way. But first would be the bran. The bran is essentially the seed coat of that wheat berry. It's about 15% of the whole weight of the kernel. And it's primarily insoluble, but that's where your vitamins and minerals and fiber are found. Okay. Next would be the endosperm. That's the white stuff in the middle. That's the starchy stuff. That's the stuff that we all think of as actually flour or white flour. It's the biggest component of the wheat kernel itself, about 82%. And that's where your carbohydrates and your protein and your soluble fiber rather, and certainly the starch is found. That's another thing that we would call it would be the storage bin of that actual kernel. And finally, if the endosperm is the storage bin, then the germ is the reproductive part of this kernel of wheat. It's only about 3%, but it's actually the embryo. So if you were to take this kernel of wheat and plant it in the ground and get it to germinate, that's where the new plant would emerge from. It's going to come from the germ.
Its initial energy source as it sprouts and grows is probably the endosperm, because that's carbohydrate. That's
exactly
what the energy is.
That's exactly right, Dave. That's exactly right. And again, the germ is a very high fat content. So again, in the milling process, what we're trying to do is separate. The first thing we want to do is try to separate these three things, unless we're looking for whole wheat flour. If it's whole wheat flour, all we're going to do is grind it up, and all three of those components go into whole wheat flour. But for a number of reasons, we have in our flour milling industry, we've come to separate these three items. Bran can be a little hard on the palate, shall we say. It can be bitter. Some people don't want all of that extra fiber in their flour. And also from a germ perspective, because of that high fat content, you can have rancidity issues pretty quickly with flour if you leave it in there. And that's why you can't keep whole wheat around for as long as you can regular flour. So in the United States, we divide our wheat up in three main ways. First would be the growth habitat, second would be the hardness, and the third would be color. Now, in each one of those three different classifications, there's another binary split. First, on the growth habitat, we have winter or spring. That's what we call the vernalization. That's when the wheat is planted and when it is grown. Winter wheat is planted in the fall. In fact, we'll be planting winter wheat here in the next month. Some places we're already planting winter wheat. That wheat will germinate and come up. When winter gets here and it gets cold, that wheat will go into dormancy. And then once winter is through and it starts to warm up, that wheat will come back again and grow until mature. And then it's harvested in late spring and early summer.
I like my lawn.
Right. Exactly. Just like your lawn.
Goes to sleep in the winter.
Goes to sleep in the winter. And spring wheat is a type of wheat that is planted in the spring. It comes up in that springtime, grows throughout the summer, and then is harvested before fall. Okay.
We're just kind of finishing up spring wheat harvest as we speak.
As we speak right now, we're almost done with spring wheat harvest. Now, the next thing would be hardness, and that's simply a very binary distinction between how much crushing resistance that particular grain has. Think about it this way. hard wheat is going to be, it's easier to think about this in terms of the products that it produces, right? But hard wheat is tougher on a mill than soft wheat. Soft wheat provides very little crushing resistance, and it also provides very little resistance in your mouth when you're eating cake,
So
right?
the cake I was eating was probably the soft wheat.
Exactly, exactly. And then the last one would be color, red or white. Now we're not talking about scarlet and cream like my Huskers go big red. It has more to do with red being of an amber type of a color, or the white being a tan, or I guess I could call it even cream, a creamy type color. It's not very, very red or white. And that again is just the seed coat pigmentation. Now, from there, the USDA in the United States classifies our wheat into 5 main classes, and those are what you see here on the left. And again, we've got all 3 of those classifications. We've got winter or spring, we've got soft or hard, and we certainly have red or white. All right, so let's step down through these a little bit. First would be soft red, winter wheat. Those are red dots, and you can see here that is very widely dispersed amongst the eastern half of the continental United States. Now, there are some concentrations, obviously here in southern Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri Boot Heel area is a big area. Up here in the Ohio and Michigan, a lot of soft red up there, and then also up and down the eastern seaboard a little bit, the mid-Atlantic states, mainly North Carolina, right? A lot of soft red because that type of wheat requires a good bit more water. And guess what? There's a lot more water that falls east of this line right here. I believe it's the 100th parallel, right? Next would be white. This is white winter, can be hard white winter. It can be hard white spring, actually. And most of that is grown up here in the PNW. Oregon, Washington is where most of that's grown, a good bit in Idaho, but it's difficult to see. But there's a couple of pockets here, southwestern Kansas, Colorado, as well as up into Nebraska, a little bit of white wheat, hard white winter wheat in those regions as well. Next would be hard red winter. That's indicated by the blue dots. That is our biggest class of wheat, as you can see, and it's located right here, mostly Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, most certainly, is where we grow most of that hard red winter wheat. Colorado, Nebraska, South Dakota, a little bit into Montana as well. On the spring wheat side of things, we have hard red, which is our largest class of spring wheat. And that's this kind of tan-ish color, orange tan, if you will. The Dakotas, western Minnesota, and Montana is where we grow most of our hard red spring wheat. And finally, Durham. Durham is purple on this map, and those purple dots are up here, mostly North Dakota and Montana. And up here in the northwest corner of North Dakota and northeastern corner of Montana.
And as you get up into the Canadian prairies, it's the 2 spring wheats that they primarily plant.
Right. It's interesting you note that, Dave. That rolls right on up here into Canada. Just north of North Dakota is Manitoba, right? And then next to that is Saskatchewan. We grow a lot of spring wheat and durum wheat up in those areas. There is some winter wheat you can see in through here up into South Dakota and Montana, and even a couple of dots here and there, some hard red winter wheats in areas, but it's just far enough north that winter wheat is a difficult thing to grow. Winters up there are much tougher, long and hard, and it's much more difficult to get that wheat to last through the winter months. So a little more on those classes. Hard red winter, as you might recall from that map, where Kansas is primarily hard red winter wheat. It's our largest class of wheat in the United States. It's about 40% on average. It's a middle protein type of wheat. And because it is the largest grown class of wheat, it's probably the thing that we make the most stuff out of. You see there yeast breads, pizza, general use. If you're going to go to the store and buy a loaf of pan white bread off the shelf, probably going to be hard red winter wheat. If you walk around the corner and buy a sack of flour or all-purpose flour to use in the home, it's probably going to be hard red winter wheat. The next class is hard red spring. It's usually a little more than 20%. Again, it's very high in protein in comparison to these others. And it's used in hearth breads and hard rolls and bagels, anything that needs that bigger bite, anything that needs that extra strength, okay, is going to be made with hard red spring wheat.
When you say bite and strength, what does that mean?
When I talk about strength, we're talking about a product that needs a lot of structure, or that your cake, for instance, that you ate for lunch doesn't have a lot of structure, right? You want a very, very soft mouthfeel, and we'll get to that next.
Okay.
Right? But a bagel, nobody wants a bagel that tastes like a donut, right? That's where the strength I'm talking about.
Okay.
The other thing I'm talking about from a strength perspective is frozen products. You know, we deal in the food business, and there's a lot of food manufacturers that make frozen goods, and a lot of them use a dough. They need that dough to be strong and have strength to withstand the freezing and thawing process,
Okay,
and not fall apart in the consumer's kitchen.
that makes sense.
So that's what I'm talking about from a strength perspective. Soft red winter would be the next one, and we're just talking about cake, right? Soft red class of wheat is a little bit less than 20% on average. It's usually very low in protein comparatively, and it has a very soft bite. The cakes, the pastries, cookies, crackers.
Cookies and crackers.
Yep, is soft red winter wheat.
You also refer to protein in all those. About on an average year, what is the protein content of those three major wheats?
Great question. Hard red winter wheat, and I've got another note at the very end of the presentation today that you can refer to. But usually, hard red winter wheat is typically somewhere between 11 and 13% protein. Okay, hard red spring wheat is going to be at least 2 percentage points higher than that, somewhere between 12 and 15% of protein. And soft red winter wheat, again, it's a larger variation, but that can be as low as maybe only 6% protein and maybe as high as 10 or 11% protein.
Okay.
The cake flour that is going to be used to make your cake is likely going to be on the lower end of that scale, somewhere in the 6 to 8, possibly 9% protein. Okay. Now, the next class of wheat by the USDA is shown here as 3 different things. We've got hard white winter, we've got hard white spring, and we've got soft white winter. Now, all 3 of those combined represent a little less than 15% of the total of our U.S. wheat output every year. And again, you can go through the different classifications here: mid protein, high protein, low protein. One thing that ties all of these 3 together is they are very heavily used in the Asian noodle market, and not just Asian noodles. I shouldn't split off Asian noodles completely, but that's where it started. The ramen noodles and that sort of thing. But they are also now used a little bit more on more traditional American or Western pasta too. And then that leaves the last one, durum. It's funny, durum is a very hard wheat. It's also one of the most red in terms of its seed coat. They call it hard amber durum, right? And so rather than get us all mixed up, we just call it durum. It's about 5% of the total of our U.S. wheat output. It's middle to high range of protein, and its use is primarily in pasta. Long goods, spaghetti and other types of long goods, as well as flat goods, lasagna, that sort of thing, as well as the different macaronis, etc. Oh, I screwed that up, didn't I? And maybe I need
Just click on the slide.
if I gotta get it there. There we go. So flour pricing. Let's talk a little bit about how we price this flour. There are three main components to pricing flour. And the first you have to start with the thing that it's made out of, wheat. Okay, so when we're pricing wheat, we start with futures. That's the price of wheat at one of the three main exchanges, Kansas City, Chicago, or Minneapolis. We also have basis. Basis is that differential between that futures exchange and wherever the mill is located. And finally, we have mill feed. Mill feed is a byproduct of the milling process. It's the other stuff. Essentially, if you remember back when I was talking about the three types or the three main components of a wheat berry, the bran and the germ and the endosperm, mill feed is the bran and the germ. It's the other stuff, right? And it's maybe some other low grade flour streams that we don't want. And that has a value to the miller. And so the miller will credit that value back to the flour buyer. Okay. So that's the three main components. Let's dive into those a little bit. First of all, wheat futures. Most of the wheat that gets traded here in the United States begins by being priced off of one of the exchanges. And I say most, I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. So the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, oddly enough, Dave, do you know where the Chicago Merc is located?
It's in Chicago.
Yeah, that's funny because, that's always one of our jokes. But I'd be lying if I told you some people didn't really know that. And the other funny thing about this particular thing, I have underneath that the Chicago soft red winter wheat, as well as the Kansas City hard red winter wheat. Those two contracts are both traded in Chicago. The Chicago Merc bought the Kansas City Board of Trade some years ago, and it is now housed and traded in Chicago. So it's a little confusing.
Kansas City wheat is traded in Chicago.
Right.
It used to be traded in Kansas City. But I'm old enough to have actually been on the floor of the Kansas City Wheat Exchange. So.
Right. It's fun, isn't it? The other big exchange here in the United States is the Minneapolis Grain Exchange, and that's where we trade all of our hard red spring wheat. Okay, now back to the exception. The exception is that some wheats that are traded here in the United States are traded on a cash market. They are not traded versus any exchange. And the primary one would be Durham. Our Durham wheat that is traded here in the United States is traded on a cash market, and it's traded either FOB Minneapolis or FOB Chicago, but it is a cash market that is traded. So enough said about that, wheat futures. The next component, basis. Now, I talked about the difference between what those futures are worth, what that futures contract is worth in Chicago or in Minneapolis. Basis is the difference between that price and whatever that wheat that is going to be ground up for your flour is worth at the mill. So think about it this way. Let's say that your mill is in St. Louis, Missouri. Okay, that wheat in St. Louis, Missouri is a different value than the wheat that would be FOB Chicago, right? And that difference is the basis. There's a lot of things that can go into that difference. Obviously, transportation. There's freight involved between Chicago and St. Louis, and that may also include the freight from the farmer to the mill. There's storage costs. There's elevation. There's interest. There's insurance that goes into that. And then there's obviously supply and demand. And part of that supply and demand is quality. Now, I put quality in quotes there because wheat is one of the only grains where quality plays a major role in the basis, right? Back in your day, Dave, when you were buying beans, once upon a time down in Augusta, you were just buying beans. Beans were beans.
Number two beans is number two beans.
And it's number two beans in Augusta, Georgia, as it is in Mason City, Iowa, right?
The difference becomes freight at that point. Yep.
Right. Wheat is one of the things where protein for sure, and to a lesser degree, milling characteristics can play a role in that basis. The way things are set up today, the American farmer is incented on providing higher protein. He gets, generally speaking, a little more protein, or a little more money for higher protein. And so he wants to deliver a higher protein if he can to get that extra premium. And that's why it's a little bit different. And quality, that term quality it kind of ends up being a catch-all phrase, and it's probably shouldn't be. But in this case, we're talking about quality. It's about protein.
What that premium is that you get through a higher basis or a wheat with higher protein really kind of depends on the year and how much protein is available.
Exactly.
Mother Nature largely is the thing that kind of governs that for us, right?
Right. And case in point, this year we had a great growing season for all of our winter wheats as well as our spring wheats. And, we're not going to have a record crop, but we didn't have as many acres anyway. But we had outstanding yields this year, a lot of quantity, because that wheat plant didn't have to be stressed very much. Consequently, without a lot of stress, we had lower proteins.
A lot of bushels, not quite as much protein.
Not quite as much protein. Now, here's some quick examples. Hard red winter wheat, 12% protein, which is kind of a middle of the road type of protein. Kansas City spot. So this is FOB Kansas City. 80 cents over the KC futures that are traded in Chicago. Try not to be too confusing. Hard red spring, 14% protein, Minneapolis basis, about $1.50 over Minneapolis today. Now, here's another thing that's a little bit different. Seems like there's a lot of differences in wheat compared to these other commodities, but I've got soft red winter milling quality, FOB St. Louis, versus soft red wheat export quality, FOB St. Louis. Look at that difference, 90 cents a bushel difference. Now,
the rest of the world ain't as picky as we are.
That's right. That's right. If we're just going to export it, we don't need to have fantastic quality. At the same time, our mills in St. Louis and other soft wheat millers, they want a very good, high quality wheat to make your cake flour that you ate today. So that's basis. Here's a little bit of a look at the KC12s. Over time, back here in the early 2020s, we only had about a 50-cent variation for a long time. And then guess what? We had a bit of a tough year. We ran all the way up to almost $4. And then, we came back to earth. Oh, wait, what happened then? Well, guess what? We rolled some tanks into Ukraine and we ran right back up the hill to over $3 a bushel. But since then, we've kind of come down. Now we've had a couple of pretty good growing season last year where we went back below that kind of that midline. And then certainly this year, kind of setting up the same way. Here's another way to look at it, a little bit more of a seasonal. This is our 5-year average of where those basis levels have been. And we're starting out this year about where we normally would be, maybe a little bit lower. Finally, mill feed. Again, mill feed is that byproduct I was talking about.
Mill feed is the animal feed that comes out of the mill.
That's right, if you want to put it that way. It is, as Dave said, an animal feed, mostly to the beef industry, also to dairies. Cows don't mind this at all, and so it rolls into that feed ration very easily. It depends on where you make it, and the quality of that feed can vary a lot depending on exactly what you're milling. But it'll typically trade at about 70 to 80% the value of corn. And again, it has a very strong seasonal, just kind of like that basis did. But look at this. This is Kansas City mids over the last several years. And every one of these drops. Okay, when is that? Summertime, right? Summertime. How's that song go? That's when you see mill feed prices at their low, because we have a lot of grass growing in the summer. Cows would rather eat grass than mill feed. And so typically that price is much lower. On the other hand, conversely, all of these spikes are in the winter. That's when we don't grow a lot of grass. That's when we supplement a lot of our feed rations with more mill feed. And that's why you have a pretty strong seasonal in your mill feed values. So let's walk through a flour pricing a little bit, okay? Let's assume that we're going to use an all-purpose flour that's that's using hard red winter wheat to make that flour, it's going to be in Kansas City, Missouri. Okay. First of all, we got to start with our futures. That wheat, Kansas City futures yesterday closed the December contract, closed at 565. Today, 12% protein wheat in Kansas City is worth about 80 cents a bushel over the board. And so your wheat cost, FOB the mill in Kansas City, is now $6.45 per bushel. Okay? Now, we've got to make flour out of it. We typically get it takes 2.3 bushels of wheat to produce 100 pounds of flour. Again, that's a rule of thumb in the milling industry. It can vary by mill and miller, but that's the number that we typically use is 2.3. And so 2.3 is our factor. So now our wheat cost FOB the mill is $14.84 per hundredweight. Okay? Or 14 cents per pound. But typically the milling industry has always used hundredweight because once upon a time, you would measure the mill's output by how many 100-pound sacks that it could do in a day. So we've stuck with hundredweight since then. Now, we talked about mill feed credit. Here's our mill feed credit. It is worth $70 a ton right now for that mill in Kansas City. Not great, but guess what? Corn is pretty inexpensive right now, and we're still coming out of summer. So 70 bucks a ton. We convert that to a hundredweight pricing, and the mill is going to credit back to the buyer $1.33. Okay, so now that raw flour cost at the mill, $13.51.
This is your $14.84 minus your $1.80, $1.33.
$1.33. Now, what goes on top of that? Everybody might look at that and go, wow, that's really, really cheap. Well, the first thing that a miller might say is, well, wait a minute.
We haven't even started doing anything to it yet.
We haven't even put anything in my pocket yet. Remember, this was going to be bagged flour, so I've got to put a bag on it. I've got to put it on pallets. I have to get a truck. Because it's all-purpose flour, it probably is going to have some treatments to it, one of those being enrichment. And all of those things are going to be extra costs that go and get tacked on to the bottom. Freight, packaging, treatments, etc. But that is a very quick and easy way of going through the pricing of flour. Finally, to wrap this thing up, let's talk a little bit about quality. Now, flour quality, I've talked about it a little bit throughout this call, and I've kept putting air quotes around it because many times quality in the flour milling business comes to mean protein, but that's too easy of an answer, okay? The quality and the functionality of a particular wheat starts in the field with the farmer. And then that goes and moves on to the miller and finally to the baker. But the end game, it has to be the customer satisfaction. Because if you don't like that cake that you ate today for lunch, you won't buy that cake again. If
Panera, if that bagel in Panera is not what Panera and Panera's customers think it is, then doesn't work.
It doesn't work. They won't sell, and they're not going to make any money. And so Panera's not going to buy flour from, it just goes right back down the line. So the customer and that satisfaction is the end all beat all when it comes to quality. Well, how do we get there? This again is another long standing diagram, but I'm not going to go through it all. I want you to focus on one thing, and that's down here at the bottom. Okay. What you see in this diagram is this fellow by the name of Feeks came up with this, and he delineated the different growth cycles of a wheat plant. Okay. And back here at the beginning, it's called tillering. Okay, that's when the plant first germinates, and you get one leaf, then you get two leaves, then you get four leaves, and then hopefully you get eight leaves, and it goes on from there. And that tillering is all at the very beginning of the growth stage. Well, guess what? That's when your yield potential is at its highest. And as you move down that scale, now you're getting to the spot where we actually have a node and now a stem, and finally get to the spot where we have a flag leaf, and the head of the wheat plant is what they call in the boot. You can't see it, but it's just beginning to be there. And again, you still have pretty strong yield potential then. But now we're getting towards the end of the growth stage, and we get to where we have a head, right? We now have a head, and then there's flowering, and there's a head with kernels on it and everything else. And our yield by that point is largely become defined. We know about what our yield is going to be, but the functionality of that flour can be, or of the wheat, it can be largely moved one way or the other at these very late stages of growth. All right. So again, the functional flour, 70% of that functionality comes from the wheat itself. Okay. A little bit can be determined in the milling process, probably a little more or less than 20%. And then the last little bit, maybe 5%, can be determined by different additives that we can put into the flour at the mill. But again, what can impact that wheat and the functionality of that? Environmental variation. We talked about this year versus last year, and how that growing season went. The type of wheat variety, and whether or not that wheat variety is drought resistant or has rust resistance. The mill and where it's at, and the segregation, right? A mill in Augusta, Georgia is going to be different than the mill in Fargo, North Dakota. They're going to be milling two different types of wheat. There's different geographic and weather issues that are different between those two. They're going to be sourcing different types of wheat and sourcing their mill streams differently. So there's a lot of things that can be done in that milling process, right? And again, when we're talking about how that can affect our flour spec, and again, you mentioned Panera as an example. Every year, each company and each flour milling company and each buyer of flour,
food companies,
have to go through a new crop transition. Now, we hope, we being in the food business, whether we're on the mill side of the business or on the bakery side of the business, we hope that transition is uneventful, right? Panera doesn't want to see any difference between bagels that are made with old crop flour versus that bagel that is now made with new crop flour.
Yeah, because of the weather last growing season versus this growing season, there was probably a pretty significant difference if you just took X varietal of wheat versus the new crop, because the protein's a lot lower this year, you'd mentioned. And
right.
So you got to go back and they got to reformulate.
They got to reformulate. There's blending. There's actually a lot of art that goes into the milling process.
I've always said that.
And there's a lot of back and forth between the miller and the baker on tweaking things just right. What's the falling number going to do that can be impacted by sprout? If there's too much rain at the end of the growing cycle and that head, the actual kernel sprouts in the head, that can dramatically change the falling number and those enzymes in that endosperm. The process, I mentioned their mill origin. Older mills have a tendency to be a little softer on wheat, and newer mills have a tendency to be a little tougher on wheat, and that's what we call starch damage. Sometimes it can be a little rough on that wheat, and that can cause differences in absorption at the bakery. That flour may be able to absorb more or less water. And finally, bakery. Sometimes some of these food processors may have a high-speed blender or an extrusion type of process that really beats up that dough before it's, gets to the oven, let's say. And that can obviously affect what's going on with the quality and the functionality of the flour. So just a couple more things as we wrap up. A buyer of wheat flour probably ought to know at least these few terms, okay? And there's a gazillion more, but these are the ones that kind of stick out. First being protein, we've mentioned it many, many times, and that is the protein not only of the wheat itself, but also the protein of your flour. Typically, when you mill wheat, you lose about 1% of protein in the milling process, okay? But at the same time, protein is not a real reliable index for what is, again, quality, this big term we keep throwing around.
Part of it, but it's not all of it.
It's not all of it. And again, in this case, I've got underlined quality of the protein itself is more important than the quantity of protein, okay? The next term would be moisture. When you get your COA, if you're buying flour, when you get your COA, you're going to see moisture, ash, and protein, or protein, moisture, and ash. Not necessarily in those orders, but moisture is simply a measure of the water that's present in that flour after it's been milled. Usually it's 14% or less. Ash. Now this is a bit of a funny one, but ash is again, it's a quantitative test that gives you an idea of the mineral content or the bran that's in that flour. You take a sample of flour, you incinerate everything off, so it burns everything that it can.
Carbohydrate is burned off.
It's all gone. So the only thing that's left is the mineral content, right? And so you get to a spot where if you had whole wheat flour, you ground up the entire kernel, you're going to have an ash that's in the 1.5% range. When you have white flour, typical white flour is going to be about 0.5%. So about a third of what's there is going to be left. And so that's going to be on your COA that you're looking at. A couple of other ones that probably aren't necessarily on your COA would be gluten. Everybody has probably heard of that term, gluten. But in this case, we talk about gluten being that matrix that's formed in the dough when you put water with the flour and you make a dough. You can make a gluten matrix, and it gets together like my fingers are right there, and it allows for that retention of gas, and that's when we get leavened bread, right? The dough will rise in the oven.
Is that when you're talking about the strength of the product?
Yes.
Something higher in gluten would be higher in strength.
Exactly. Let's jump ahead. Let's go ahead to the bottom there. Strength. That stronger flours can raise that fermentation ability, and it can increase because it's stronger. You may have to mix it out a little bit more. That dough has to be mixed a little bit longer. And the last one, then going back up one, would be absorption. And I mentioned this earlier too. Again, that's the amount of water that the flour can soak up in the dough in the mixing process, right? Sometimes if you get most bakers are going to want to sell water because water is cheap, right? But if you get too much water, that dough can get what we call extensible, or there's very little elasticity, there's no strength, and it gets just to be blah in the pan. You won't get a lot of rise out of that loaf of bread, let's say. All right, finally, I mentioned this earlier. Here's a quick little matrix that you can go through, and there's a gazillion variations on this, but this is a very, very, again, high level, 7 different ways to look at it. The top 2 are made with soft wheat, cake and pastry flour. You can see those proteins are no higher than about 9% and very, very low ash. We don't want a lot of protein, we don't want a lot of bran content in our cake flour, right?
We don't want cake. You probably don't need it to be whole wheat.
We don't need it to be whole wheat, and we don't want it to be bitter. So there's ones in the middle. Certainly the next 2, and maybe the hard style, is usually going to be that kind of middle of the road, hard red winter wheats, hard white winter wheats, 9 to maybe 12 or 13% protein. 50 to maybe mid 50s on the ash percentage. And again, it's, cupcakes, all-purpose flour, biscuits, breads, pizza. A lot of pizza dough is made with that. And then we get down to the bottom. The next two are going to be your higher proteins, mostly spring wheats, between 12 and 14% protein. Again, mid 50s, 0.50s to 0.56 or so on the ash. Hearth breads, baguettes, anything that's made on a stone. And then obviously bagels and a lot of frozen products that I mentioned earlier, anything that needs a lot of strength. And then obviously at the very bottom, whole wheat. Most of the time, whole wheat, if you're buying whole wheat flour that's on the shelf at the grocery store, it's going to be between 12 and 14%. It's going to be an ash of 1.5, as I mentioned. And if you're buying a loaf of bread that's whole wheat, typically it's going to be somewhere in that same 12 to 14% range on protein. So that kind of wraps it up for us today on Wheat for Flour 101. If you have any questions, and I don't see any, I'm not sure if Martha has seen any questions on the chat here today. If you do have a question afterwards, please don't hesitate to give us a call. You've got all of our emails there. Drop us a note. We'd love to hear from you. And I also believe that this presentation will be available. This recording will be available for those that couldn't be with us today. So if you want to pass this along to a colleague or somebody else, feel free to do that as well.
And I think if you've registered for the webinar, Martha, don't we just email copies of the recording, the YouTube recording out? So they'll have the slides and the audio that goes with it.
Yeah. So you've been a great audience today, a little quiet, but thanks for that. And until the next time. Yeah, thank you for joining us. Until the next time.